Hello friends, tonight we're stepping into a version of ancient Rome that your textbooks politely chose to leave out. Picture this. The moon is hanging low. The world around you is quiet. And somewhere in the shadowy corners of history, a Roman senator receives a scroll with a subtle message. Take care of it before sunset, or we will, in a louder fashion. This isn't the story of great emperors or glorious victories. This is where things get weird punishments that are both horrifying and strangely artistic enough to make today's reality shows look like meditation retreats. From flaming robes to sacks filled with snakes, Rome didn't just punish, they staged a production. And hey, a gentle warning: if you think you could have survived ancient Rome, chances are you were already eliminated at your very first breakfast. So before you settle into your pillow, take a moment to like the video and hit subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what we're doing here. And don't hesitate to leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing our sleepless empire lighting up across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's step into tonight's journey. In the heart of ancient Rome, beyond the marble columns and echoing forums, there was one fear greater than lions or war: the fear of making the wrong mistake at the wrong time, with the wrong punishment delivered in an extremely unpleasant way. Although ancient Rome is famous for its ahead-of-its-time innovations, paved roads, sewage systems, even a rudimentary form of democracy, there's a lesser-known aspect. They were incredibly creative when it came to punishing others. Not the kind of creativity you'd use to write poetry or build sandcastles. This was the kind that makes you shudder and wonder, did they really invent this just to punish someone? And you'll see the Romans didn't just want you dead. They wanted you to remember why before you died, and if possible to make sure the entire city never forgot either. Let's begin with one of Rome's most distinctive features: the Vestals, priestesses of the goddess Vesta. For them, keeping the eternal flame burning was the holiest duty. But with that honor came a 30-year vow of chastity. No men, no affection, no falling in love. It may sound extreme, but in Rome, if you were a Vestal and broke that vow, you weren't fired. You weren't exiled. No, you were buried alive. Why not just execute them with a sword like other criminals? Because spilling a Vestal's blood was seen as an offense to the gods. So they opted for a clean solution: dig a pit, lower the woman inside with a bit of bread water and an oil lamp, just enough to claim it wasn't intentional murder, then cover it with earth. And she would lie there in absolute darkness, in absolute silence, waiting for the inevitable. As for the man involved, he usually didn't get the courtesy. He was beaten to death right in the street under the gaze of hundreds of onlookers, a clear reminder: religion is not a joke. If you thought that was chilling, meet another Roman specialty, poeniculae, the punishment of the sack. Sounds harmless, but don't be fooled. This was reserved for one of the most heinous crimes in Roman society, patricide. And you wouldn't be facing your sentence alone. The guilty party would have their hands tied and be sewn into a large leather sack alongside 4 special cellmates. A dog, symbol of the loyalty you betrayed, a snake, treachery, a rooster, vigilance, and a monkey, pure chaos. Then the sack was sewn shut and tossed into a river. The result: a living stew of howling, hissing, screeching, and finally utter silence. No one is entirely sure why those 4 animals were chosen. But clearly the Romans had a very thematic approach to designing pain. Everything had meaning. Everything was symbolic, and all of it said one thing: your crime now has claws, fangs, and feathers, and it's sharing your final breath. Then there was crucifixion, a punishment many of us associate with one very famous figure, Jesus Christ. But in Rome, this wasn't an exception, it was a tool. A tool to make examples, to remind the public not to test the empire's power. You didn't just die, You died in agony, in thirst, in the pitying and terrified gaze of the crowd. And if you were a special case, Rome might even flip you upside down. Peter, the apostle of Jesus, is one example. When sentenced to crucifixion, he requested to be hung upside down, feeling unworthy to die in the same manner as his teacher. And the Romans, sure. Blood rushed to his head, legs dangling each breath, a struggle, a painful performance with spiritual meaning that the Romans themselves didn't really care about. And if you were a Roman soldier, but a coward, refused to fight. Get acquainted with decimation, perhaps the most brutal group lesson ever recorded. If a unit was found guilty of desertion or disgraceful failure, 10 soldiers were chosen. 9 of them would beat the last one to death, their own comrade. Not out of hatred, just discipline. After that, the remaining 9 weren't much better off. Their rations were switched from wheat to barley animal feed. They had to sleep outdoors and, of course, carried the burden of, we killed one of our own. It wasn't just punishment. It was fear carved into the heart, so that next time, whether facing enemies or gods, they wouldn't dare turn back. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. In the next few minutes, we'll continue exploring more stylized punishments, from deadly sacks to flaming robes, from names erased from history to conspiracies that end with you taking your own life in a bathtub, all bearing the signature flair of an empire that loved to make a statement. If you think this is a journey into darkness, you're right. But like any sleep, sometimes we have to pass through the night to understand the light. Still awake. We haven't even reached the scariest part yet. Perfect. Are you sitting tight now? Because from here, things will begin to spiral in true Roman fashion. And in Roman history, spiraling didn't mean losing your reputation or career. It meant being thrown off a cliff. Welcome to the Tarpeian Rock Rome's version of the real-life unfriend button. Today, if you betray someone, they'll block you on Facebook. In ancient Rome, they blocked you from the planet. The Tarpeian Rock was a cliff about 80 feet high, where the Roman state took out the trash by tossing criminals into gravity's embrace. The origin of the place is quite poetic. A girl named Tarpeia was lured by golden bracelets from the enemy and betrayed the city in exchange for them. The result? They gave her the bracelets by crushing her to death with their shields, then casually tossing her off the cliff. Who says Romans didn't keep their promises? From then on, the Tarpeian Rock became the unfriend zone for traitors, falsifiers, or simply those who annoyed the state. No lengthy trial needed. Just escort you to the edge of the cliff and farewell. Thank you for visiting the Roman Republic. Now you might be thinking, at least they didn't burn anyone alive. Oh, congratulations. You've just unlocked the next level, the death robe, also known as the tunica molesta. Sounds like a cute pajama, right? No, not at all. This was the one outfit you put on and became a human torch. They'd carefully soak it in tar oil and resin, and then instead of wishing you a warm day, they'd set it on fire. Especially popular under Nero, the emperor, who, if alive today, would definitely host a reality show called Who Shall We Burn Tonight? At his garden parties, victims dressed in flaming robes were used to light up the space, yet like living LED torches that screamed. Festival atmosphere, soothing background music, and in the middle of the garden, a person on fire like a BBQ dish, except this was one nobody wanted to eat. But that's not all. Have you ever felt like your office chair was uncomfortable? Be grateful. At least it wasn't the wooden donkey. This was a device that looked like a sadistic playground slide for adults. Essentially, it was a sharp, upright wooden beam, shaped like a triangle. You were forced to sit on it, legs hanging down, and if you were lucky, weights would be tied to your ankles to maximize the effect. Your entire body weight pressed down on exactly the place you didn't want it to. The feeling might be best compared to sitting on a cactus while trying to meditate. The goal, not necessarily to kill, but to educate in a way you'd never forget. And if you think Rome was only good at physical punishment, then you've never heard of damnatio memoriae, the punishment of erasing from memory. This was Rome's version of, we do not speak of that person anymore. No execution, no beating. They deleted you from society's memory. Your name was chiseled off inscriptions, your statues defaced your images, removed, and any achievement you once held, conveniently borrowed by someone else. One day, you're a famous general. The next, you're that awkward gap in the mural. Worse than death. Because at least the dead get a name on their grave. You never existed. Now let's say you were a noble, well-positioned, and slipped up by insulting the emperor. Don't worry, you won't be killed. You'll be invited to end things, forced suicide. A very polite method. A scroll would arrive at your home stating that you were no longer worthy of existing. If you obediently ended everything before sunset, your family got to keep the estate. If not, the empire would take care of it in a much less graceful manner. Indeed, you might die in your bathtub with wine and a final poetic monologue. Some even had time to write books. Others just left bloodstains and a fogged-up mirror. Sound far-fetched. Don't forget this was a world where writing it on your face was a form of record-keeping. You stole the letter F would be branded into your forehead. A traitor. The letter C. Calumnia, slanderer. So next time someone complains about having a public criminal record, just whisper, at least it's not written, on your face. And if you happen to speak blasphemy, sorry, you just made the list of things never to be spoken again. Not a social media ban. This was the tongue removal kind of silence. No anesthesia, no doctor, just iron tongs fire and someone who didn't care whether you protested or not. Because in ancient Rome, freedom of speech existed until you got it wrong. After that, say goodbye to vocabulary, goodbye to screams. What awaited you was a life of permanent silence. You find that funny good. That means you're still breathing, still whole, and haven't been stuffed into a sack with a snake. But this journey isn't over yet. There are many more bizarre and artistically deadly creations waiting just ahead. If you're still awake, don't worry. Well, continue. And if you've drifted off to sleep, may you not dream of a monkey screaming inside a leather bag with a snake and a rooster. And if you ever thought, oh, maybe I could lie a little to get away, Rome had an answer for you. It wasn't sure who hasn't lied before, but rather, we have a wheel, and an iron bar, and plenty of time. Introducing the breaking wheel. The wheel that broke all limits and every joint. Essentially, this punishment was like a yoga session where death was the instructor. You were bound to a large wooden wheel limb spread wide like you were posing at a rock concert, and then the executioner would slowly, yes, slowly smash each of your limbs with an iron bar. Not to kill, but to shatter piece by piece. Forearms, shins, knees, wrists, each bone processed like handmade pasta. After all parts were broken, you were then woven into the wheel, a grotesque craft project made from you. And if you survived all the blows, don't celebrate just yet. They might bless you with a final mercy strike, or simply prop you up on a post and let the wind take over until you became a bent and broken landscape ornament, a monument to, don't make the same mistake he did. Feeling suffocated yet, that's just the beginning, afraid of choking. Because Rome once asked the same question and came up with a new pastime called execution by hot ash. Hot ash, not hot chocolate. What does it mean? Well, first you were buried up to your neck body in the ground, head sticking out. Then, instead of a quick beheading or simple hanging, they chose a more creative method, pouring hot ash into your mouth. Yes, a funnel placed in your mouth, and slowly, spoon by spoon, hot ash was poured in. Not just burnt dust, it was fire given form. It blocked your breath, scorched your throat, and most importantly, it didn't spill a drop of blood. Clean, controlled, pure Nero style. Why ash? Because in Roman thinking, death by ash was an insult. Ash was garbage, the leftovers after glory had burned away. You didn't deserve a noble death. You deserved to be handled like a historical stain. Too painful. Let's change the flavor. Well, move on to something lighter, the fashion accessory for blasphemers. The fork of heretics. This was the ancient version of a posture collar. Except instead of helping you maintain form, it helped you stay completely still unless you wanted to puncture your own throat. The fork had two sharp prongs, one pressing under the chin, the other into the upper chest. It was fastened around your neck with a leather or metal strap. And you were invited to stand still, entirely. No nodding, no bowing, no deep breaths. If you moved incorrectly, you impaled yourself. This punishment didn't draw blood right away, but it crushed your spirit in silence. A bit like a 3-day parent-teacher conference, but with sharp iron added. And if you're thinking at least no one saw it, sorry. These punishments often took place in public squares, where children munched toasted bread, adults pointed, and everyone studied your suffering like a piece of street performance art. Speaking of performance, perhaps nothing thrilled Rome more than blending death with mythological drama. Enter damnatio ad bestias, the punishment of being fed to the beasts in the arena. You were a criminal, refused to worship the emperor's gods. Step right up, you're going into the Colosseum. No weapons, no final speech. But you'd be gifted a costume, maybe that of Orpheus, and right after a hungry lion would join the duet. Yes, you'd be dressed as a myth, then torn apart like a blood-soaked fairy tale ending. It wasn't execution, it was a show. A ticketed performance for the masses, a message to the empire Rome doesn't forgive. And it directs spectacularly. As terrifying as that sounds to Rome, if you spoke wrongly, thought wrongly, or worshipped wrongly, they didn't always need to kill you to win. They just needed to erase you from memory. No one would speak your name. No one dared keep your image. No one dared remember you. Damnatio memoriae. A punishment for those once powerful who happened to displease the emperor. Yesterday you were a national hero carved in marble. The next day, that statue had its face smashed. Your name scratched out from every record. Your image removed with a chisel, a hammer, and a resolve as cold as marble. You didn't just die. You were uninstalled from human history. Feeling relieved you only suffer from insomnia now. At least you're lying in a bed, not strapped to a wheel, not forced into a flammable robe, and not having to convince an emperor you deserve one more day of life. So if you've stayed awake this far, you're remarkably resilient. But don't worry. In the next part, we'll go even deeper from the art of coerced suicide to branding sin onto faces, and how Rome turned cruelty into an art form, the kind that chills you even when all you're doing is listening in the middle of the night. Now close your eyes, but don't dream of lions, unless you're fast enough to run. So then are you still awake? Good. Because the journey isn't over, in fact, we've just stepped into the part that smells like hot iron and a very creative interpretation of justice. Welcome to one of the signature inventions of a society without security cameras, ID cards, or trust branding, as in searing marks on the face. Not personal branding like you'd see on LinkedIn. This was the kind where they heated iron and pressed it into your forehead with the precision of a master blacksmith. If you were a runaway slave, a thief, or a liar, you didn't just get caught, you got gifted a permanent symbol on your face. The letter F for fur thief, C for calumnia slanderer. And if you were a runaway slave, FVG, short for fugitivus, meaning fugitive, etched into your brow as a public announcement. This one ran once and will run again. Remember this face. No cosmetic surgery, no concealer. You walk the streets as a living billboard of shame. And if you thought about covering it up, Rome thought of that too. Trying to erase, hide, or even tattoo over the mark was a new crime. That meant you weren't just a criminal. You were a criminal who felt shame, and that was even more dangerous. Next, let's visit one of the favorite punishments of emperors with a taste for politeness: forced suicide. Picture this: you're a wealthy noble living in a grand estate with 3 slaves fanning you and another slicing fruit. Then one fine morning, you receive a letter from the emperor, reading something as delicately phrased as, "You have brought dishonor to the empire. Kindly remove yourself from life before sunset." And you have 2 choices. Obey, take a perfumed bath. Write a philosophical poem about the nature of existence and slip away in your tub with a silver blade. Or disobey and let the empire assist your departure with fire rope and a shameful title added to your name forever. Bleak as it sounds for many Romans, this was a kind of political mercy. If you handled it the right way, your family could keep their property. Your name might still appear in history in small print. And at the very least, you wouldn't die screaming in the arena being chased by a lion. It's like an artfully controlled ending, isn't it? And Rome was very good at turning even silence into a weapon of punishment. Silent but razor sharp, like when they cut out your tongue. No joke. If you said something offensive to the gods or let slip a comment about the emperor at the tavern, don't expect to be forgiven with a simple apology. The Roman mindset: if your mouth caused harm, then your mouth should cease operation. No anesthesia, no emotional support. Just iron clamps, a crude knife, and hands well practiced in making people permanently silent. And you wouldn't die, not right away. But you live with a twisted mouth and a life that could never again be spoken. And you think that's the end? No. Because the Romans believed that if someone was to be punished, it had to be seen, remembered, and never forgotten. That's why there was one final symbolic punishment: no blood, no fire, no wheels, but it struck the hardest, erasing you from memory. Not the kind of unfollow you're used to. This was damnatio memoriae. It began with a decree from the emperor: this person is no longer of the empire. Then your statues had their faces smashed. Your name was scrubbed off marble. Your image cut out of frescoes. Historians were ordered to rewrite all of history, skipping over you as if you had never existed. You might have been a general, an orator, or the builder of 12 bridges. But from that moment on, you were a blank space in the record. Enemies of Rome weren't just killed. They were forgotten. And to the Romans, that was the true death. Still with me, if you're still awake, you've just taken a nighttime tour through one of the strangest collections of punishments history has ever known. A trip with no ticket, no insurance, but maybe enough to make you pause the next time you feel upset about getting blocked on TikTok or losing your Wi-Fi. Now, exhale, gently. This is the moment to close your eyes, loosen your shoulders, and remember you do not live in ancient Rome. There's no monkey pounding on your head inside a sack. No one is heating iron rods. No one's burying you alive just for falling in love. There's just you, a pillow, and a little quiet. Sleep now. No one is coming for you with a flammable robe. Definitely not. Unless you've wronged Nero. Of course you're still awake, aren't you? Good. Or at least if you're drifting somewhere between 2 worlds, one being sleep, the other a blur of a wheel and a sack of snakes, allow me to guide you a little more gently. Still Rome, still punishments, but this time on the non-lethal side, at least in theory. Let's visit the seat of power. No, not the throne, but the chair you were never meant to sit in. Welcome to the ancient version of awkward posture, the iron chair. A torture seat made of metal, usually crafted from iron, sometimes studded with spikes across its entire surface. The accused was invited to sit down occasionally, tied down for good measure. If the spikes weren't striking enough, the chair would be heated from below. Imagine sitting on a grill and you are the meat about to be cooked. This wasn't designed to kill immediately, but to make the seated individual wonder, what did I do in life to end up here? And what's more terrifying is that this often came with an audience. That's right. Citizens gathered in the square holding loaves of bread, chewing loudly, eyes fixed on this public education performance. As you sat there, hissing and writhing, hot iron slowly etched itself into your flesh. Anyone who's ever complained, "My back hurts from long meetings, please try the Roman chair just once." And just when you think Rome must be out of ideas, they say, "Wait, we have one final performance. Enter execution by non-combat animals." If you thought lions were the peak of you've lost, allow us to introduce another equally terrifying accomplice: birds. Specifically eagles, ravens, and sometimes those charming vultures read not charming at all. The method simple: the condemned was tied to a pole or a wooden plank, not killed outright, just left there, and then let nature take over. After several hours or days, as weakness set in from hunger, thirst, and injuries, those cheerful sky dwellers would descend and nibble. Not a swift death, a slow-motion buffet with you as the main course and leisurely pace as the house specialty. Sound like horror fiction. In Rome, it was called Thursday morning. Sometimes you didn't even need to commit a major crime to earn painful consequences. Some punishments were crafted purely to humiliate, like being paraded through the market with your tongue clamped between two wooden slabs, or being forced to stand in the public square wearing a dress, if you were a man. The Romans deeply understood the power of shame, and sometimes making someone a laughingstock hurt more than any whip. In a society where honor was everything, a public punishment like wearing a sign labeled "lazy" could be enough to make someone volunteer for the sack with the snake rather than live on with that nickname. Let's step away from the public squares now and retreat into somewhere more private: the prison cell. You imagine Roman prisons like those in films, with guards, chains, torches. Not quite. A Roman prison was more like a damp hole that people tended to forget about. Once thrown in, you weren't expecting much beyond the faint hope of being remembered for trial. Some prisoners stayed there for weeks, months, even years. No hearing, no notice, no one bothering to ask, "Are you okay?" But if you were prominent enough, rich enough, or just interesting enough, you might be prioritized for trial, where a judge listened to your charges while nibbling grapes. There was even something known as penalty by waiting. That meant no execution, no pardon, just existence. Like a suspended file in a bureaucratic office, you remained under the label, to be dealt with later. And in many cases, later meant slowly dying in obscurity, or surviving long enough to become a walking warning. Don't do what I did. You see, ancient Rome didn't just build a great empire. They invented an entire gallery of punishments that make you wonder, what happened to just saying "I'm sorry" and paying a 100-coin fine? From terrifying public spectacles to the kind of silent death you don't even notice. Until it's done, the Romans never did anything halfway. They didn't just want you to pay. They wanted you to become a living message. A tale retold, a lesson carved in stone. And now, as you lie here in the middle of the night, warm under your blanket, unchained, unhunted, with no one pouring ash into your mouth, maybe you'll allow yourself a quiet smile. Because wherever you are, whoever you are, we all have something to be grateful for. Like, for instance, you live in the 21st century, not in a leather sack with a monkey. Of course, and welcome back, or still drifting somewhere between waking and dreaming. Whether you're a lifelong insomniac or someone who accidentally heard a story about a snake-filled bag and got weirdly curious, congratulations, you're in the right place. And don't worry, we're not leaving Rome just yet, because when it comes to the survival games of a mighty empire, the list is always far from over. Now imagine this: you haven't killed anyone, haven't betrayed anyone, haven't stolen a thing. But you said something wrong about a god, or worse, about the emperor. The result? You lose your tongue. Not metaphorically, not a slap on the wrist. You literally lose it. This is one of the lesser-mentioned punishments in the history books, but quite beloved by rulers with thin skin and egos thick as fortress walls. One wrong word, I think Jupiter is a bit temperamental, and you're done speaking. Forever. And don't expect a modern scalpel or a kind doctor whispering, "You'll feel a little pinch." No. Your tongue would be clamped with iron, held like a slippery catfish on a chopping block, and then slice. You wouldn't die, at least not immediately. But you also couldn't tell anyone what it felt like. And what's more bitter than surviving a horror you can never describe? That was the art of punishment, not just of the body, but of the voice, the very right to exist socially. A person forever silent, though alive, becomes a kind of ghost, hovering but never daring to speak. Now then we go deeper still. Away from the squares, away from the torch-lit arenas. Let's go downward quite literally. Welcome to the crypt, the final resting place of many criminals, many lies, and more than a few dark social experiments. Roman crypts were places no one wanted to visit unless you had no other choice. They were dark, damp, and cold in a way that wasn't just outside your skin, but inside from your bones, your gut, from the thought that I'm locked in here with the past, and the past is hungry. Many prisoners weren't executed immediately. They were simply left. No lights, no food, just the occasional drip of water. And if you were lucky, the faint groans of someone dying not far away. Rome didn't need loud torture. They let you self-destruct through isolation. Some scholars even recorded that certain prisoners ended up talking to the darkness, whispering to the walls, to the rats, to themselves. And sometimes the darkness answered. You might be thinking, at least they didn't use magic. But you'd be half right. Rome didn't believe in magic, they feared it. And that's why, if you were suspected of being a witch, a summoner of spirits, or simply someone with eyes too deep, you'd find yourself quickly added to a list that needed handling. Punishment for witches in Rome wasn't like the medieval bonfires and inquisitions. No, the Romans opted for something more refined. Examples. A collar engraved with the words, "I spoke to the dead." Being locked in a room with an unburied corpse to see if you really know how to bring them back. Or simply being buried alive upside down, because if you want to reach the underworld, we'll help you get there faster. Poetically speaking, this was the moment when Rome used punishment not just for deterrence, but for entertainment. People gathered not to mourn, but to watch. There were trials that lasted hours like open-air theater. There were narrators, witnesses, weapons, and sometimes musical accompaniment. Yes, music. In some cases, lyres, double flutes, or even drums were used to elevate the artistry of an execution. Picture being hung upside down, blood running down your face, and next to you, someone playing a flute wildly off-key. Hard to say who's in more pain, you or the one forced to listen. And now, if you're still awake, I bow to you. You are a warrior of the night. You've survived snakes' hot ash wheels and even the unsettling sound of off-key flutes. You've explored a Rome that was grand, terrifying, and bizarre, in ways that defy expectation. And most importantly, you're not in a sack. So take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the glow of the screen gently fade. No lions, no leather bags, no smoke. No one asking you, have you worshipped the right God? Now as the world outside falls quiet, the lights dim, and the only sounds left are the slow turning of a fan or the rhythm of your own breath. The story continues. Because in ancient Rome, even when it seemed every horrific thing had been revealed, there was always one more strange yet silent. A punishment with no blood, no screams, no lions or ropes, only stillness. This is when Rome didn't kill you with sword or spear, but by making the world forget you ever existed. We're speaking of damnatio memoriae, but this time we view it from a deeply human angle. Not the death of the body, but the death of meaning. You could have been a great general, a prince, a man who once stood on the podium beneath laurel wreaths and thunderous applause. But all it took was a single decree, a single sentence: this person no longer belongs to us. And just like that, statues had their faces smashed. Inscriptions were scraped clean. Coins bearing your image were melted down. Historical texts once recording your name were left blank. And in a few months, years, or generations, no one truly knew who you were. Even when people found faceless marble figures or worn-out stones with missing names, they had no idea who once stood there. You became someone who never was. And with that, Rome succeeded. They didn't just kill you. They made sure you had never lived. Chilling, isn't it? A bit like when you speak something important and no one listens. When you try to say what you believe is true, but you're dismissed, silenced, treated as if your words never mattered. This Roman punishment, though thousands of years old, still echoes today as a reminder that sometimes what humans fear most isn't pain, but being forgotten. But wait, before you start to feel too grim, remember that even in an empire as strict and sophisticated in punishment as Rome, there were moments so absurd they might just make you chuckle quietly at midnight. For example, there was once a thief caught red-handed stealing a magistrate's shoes during someone else's execution. And his punishment, not a beating, not prison, but being made to clean the entire arena by hand, with the stolen shoes tied to his head like a crown. There are some cases where the punishment wasn't fully recorded, but the historians simply noted, the people laughed for 3 days, and that too was the strange magic of Rome, a place where everything could be extreme, ruthless, blazing, and yet at times so ridiculous it became hilarious. A place where you could be executed for treason, but pardoned if you managed to recite poetry in time. A place where the arena was a death stage, but sometimes the largest theater in the world. The Romans loved art, even in death, and they turned punishment into messaging. A letter written with swords, with stone, with flame. Addressed to the public with the headline, "Don't do this." And you lying there in the middle of the night may now be drifting off. This long tale has taken you through ancient squares, through bizarre punishments, through philosophies both bitter and strange, in a fallen empire that never truly left the human imagination. You've traveled through history, through silent screams, through the sound of flutes in the arena, and the whisper of ash falling into the throat of someone who dared to defy an emperor. And now, with nothing but soft breath and a pillow beneath your head, do you know what matters most? You're still here. Not forgotten, not erased, not in a sack, not on a wheel. Just a soul breathing quietly in the night, listening to a story about what's been lost, so you might better cherish what remains. When it comes to Rome's terrifying punishments, everyone wonders, who thought of all these horrific tortures? Who sat down resting their chin in their hand and suddenly had the idea, if we put a traitor in a sack with a snake, a dog, and a monkey, maybe he'll remember it forever. You might think this was the product of twisted minds, but in truth, many of those infamous punishments came from law. That's right, behind the sacks, the arenas and the wheels, was a whole system of legislation, rational and cold, and sometimes so irrational it makes later generations shiver. In the early years of the Roman Republic, when no emperor yet reigned, and only the Senate and the people Senatus Populusque Romanus held power, laws were founded to maintain social order, not for revenge. Yet the Romans had a deep love for symbolism and crowd effect. They believed punishment should not only make the offender repent, but ensure that everyone around remembered it vividly. That's why punishments were designed to humiliate publicly and leave lasting impressions. Theft wasn't just about jail or lashes. Sometimes you'd be forced to wear a basket-shaped hat and paraded through the market for mockery. Offended the gods, don't expect just a fine. You might have to kneel all day in the temple arms, wrapped around a stone pedestal forehead, pressed into dust, begging forgiveness under hundreds of curious eyes. This was the spirit of mos maiorum, the tradition of the ancestors, which ancient Rome held as the guiding compass for all behavior. But not every punishment came from moralists. Many emerged from fierce legal disputes trials, where law was recorded based on the feelings of the powerful. In the Law of the 12 Tables, circa 450 BCE, there was one clause that would chill any modern reader if you owed a debt and couldn't pay your creditor, had the right to cut off a portion of your body equivalent to the debt. Sounds like satire, but ancient Rome wrote it clearly. If there were multiple creditors, your body would be divided. An arm for this one, a leg for that. A system of bodily distribution by percentage. Later, when Rome became an empire and power fell into the hands of emperors, all boundaries between law and personal whim blurred. Emperors like Nero Domitian or Caligula didn't write laws, but they held absolute privilege to turn any wild idea into decree. Nero, who once recited poetry while Rome burned, was infamous for executions accompanied by background music. Caligula ordered people executed just for dreaming of his death. There was even a case where a man was forced to kiss the emperor's horse's hoof to prove his loyalty. From then on, punishment in Rome wasn't just about justice, it became a stage for the egos of the powerful. Still, to be fair, the Romans didn't invent cruel punishments because they lacked ethics. On the contrary, they had their own value system: honor, loyalty, sacrifice. But they also lived in a world where softness was seen as the beginning of decline. A massive empire like Rome needed order, and public punishment was the fastest way to preserve it. Thus, every sentence wasn't just a strike against the body, but a message of dominance. Rome was one giant stage, and every execution was a performance with audience actors, props, and a blood-soaked script. On top of that, Rome had a deep obsession with perfection, idealizing the image of the model citizen. So anyone who deviated in thought, appearance, or lifestyle could become a target for correction. The deformed were seen as omens, the progressive thinkers branded traitors, and those who loved the wrong person could be exiled or worse. Over time, Roman law grew more detailed, and the punishments attached became increasingly inventive. So in the end, who thought up these bizarre, horrifying penalties? The answer likely doesn't lie in one person, but in an entire culture. A society that saw fear as its greatest tool to control human behavior. And in that picture, from judges to emperors, from citizens to philosophers, all played a part in coloring those brutal punishments into the most vivid artworks of blood-soaked history. Rome didn't just build temples, it built nightmares, and called them law. Now, before we turn off the lights completely and drift into sleep, let's speak of the one thing the Romans feared more than lions, more than battlefield defeat, the wrath of the gods. That's right. In ancient Rome, people didn't just believe in the gods, they lived with them, breathed with them, and occasionally trembled because of them. Every road, every doorway, every stream, even every time you accidentally sneezed too loudly, could be a sign that some deity was watching. Rome didn't have just one god. They had a council, a busy, powerful, and to be honest, rather temperamental pantheon. From Jupiter, the supreme god with a majestic beard and a thunderous mood, to Mars, the bloodthirsty god of war, or Venus, the goddess of beauty, whom anyone daring to insult could find themselves accidentally caught in a tragic love affair. And then there were the smaller gods known as noumena, something like municipal clerks of the divine world, responsible for every tiny detail of life. A god for doorways, a god for the hearth, a god for smooth digestion after dinner. Yes, really. That's why Rome was a society that didn't joke about the spiritual. And so punishment there wasn't just social, it was also spiritual cleansing. You committed a crime against the law, you might be beheaded. You committed a crime against the gods. Congratulations, you'd be handled specially. A famous example, poena culae, the punishment of being sewn into a sack with a snake, a dog, a monkey, and a rooster. Sounds absurd. But actually, it was Rome's way of spiritually disposing of those who murdered their parents, because they didn't deserve to be buried in the earth, didn't deserve to ascend to heaven, and didn't deserve to exist in the material or spiritual world. Dissolved among cursed and sacred animals, the criminal was sent straight into a void, a kind of erasure not just of body, but of identity. As for those suspected of witchcraft, summoning spirits, or simply having strange eyes, they were often punished in religious rituals, not for revenge, but to cleanse the energy of the community. The gods, especially Jupiter, could not tolerate odd energy. And the people, they didn't dare risk it. The result, the accused might be buried alive beneath a temple, or left to starve in darkness, a sacrificial offering, unwelcome but required. Religion in Rome, then, was not a private affair between individual and deity. It was collective. Belief wasn't just a personal choice, it was a civic duty. You didn't just have to believe, you had to show your belief at the right time in the right way, and preferably as grandly as possible. Skip a ritual. You could be fined. Forget to burn incense on a feast day. You might be beaten. Say out loud that you're not sure any gods really exist. Sorry, that could count as treason. And in a society where the emperor was also considered a god, the blending of religion and politics into a dangerous cocktail was inevitable. Emperors like Augustus, Caligula, and Domitian all demanded worship as living deities. And guess what? Those who refused were granted the chance to experience the punishments you and I have just explored earlier. Behind every sack, every flaming wheel, every lash, every flute-playing execution, there stood one silent force, fear of the divine. It wasn't just a supernatural kind of fear. It was a collective obsession that if someone who committed a crime wasn't punished severely enough, then the gods would punish the entire community instead. Drought, plague, floods, lightning. If someone accidentally brushed against a sacred statue and didn't bow to apologize, and the village lost its crops the next day, well then time for a very big offering. Thus, every punishment, no matter how horrific, came with a sacred label to protect the sanctity. A holy wrapper around cruelty, a divine excuse for final solutions. And then centuries passed. The Roman Empire fell. Temples crumbled, statues lost their heads, whips rusted. But that logic of punishment as a way to please the gods still lingers somewhere in human society. If you think ancient Roman punishments are the only thing that'll make your skin crawl, just wait until you hear about their everyday customs. No, I'm not talking about how they cooked or mixed wine. I'm talking about traditions so odd, so archaic, you'll find yourself wondering, who wrote this, and were they okay? Shall we begin? Imagine you're a woman in ancient Rome. Every morning you're not just worried about washing your hair with ash water, but you might also be sold by your husband, like a goat. Yes, the wife-selling custom was real. Not officially in the law, but socially accepted as a form of domestic resolution. Some husbands, when feeling incompatible with their wives, would tie a rope around her wrist, lead her to the public market, and hand her over to another man, perhaps a friend, a creditor, a neighbor, or anyone with enough coins and patience. Sounds absurd. But in that society, women were seen as transferable property. And if you think children had it any better, sorry, bad news. In Rome, a newborn wasn't necessarily considered a person. There was a custom called expositio, meaning that when a baby was born, the father had the right to reject it if he believed the child had bad omens or was simply too weak. Rejected infants were left in market corners, temple steps, or strangers' doorways, hoping someone might take them in. If not well, so be it. Only when the father physically lifted the baby in his arms was the child officially accepted as a member of the family. Until that moment, the infant was merely a possibility of life. Even so, once a child was allowed to live, that didn't guarantee a peaceful childhood. At many lavish Roman feasts, it was customary to introduce a symbolic figure of death. This person, often a slave or a costume performer, would wander among the guests, whispering into each ear, "Remember, you will die." A philosophical reminder about the fragility of life. Perhaps. But imagine gnawing on a chicken leg when someone wearing a skull mask leans in and murmurs, "Tomorrow you might be flayed alive." And suddenly philosophy doesn't sit so well. Religion and superstition also gave rise to customs no less bizarre. During droughts or famines, it was believed that the blood of a slave could call the gods. And so, in certain special rituals, human blood, especially that of foreign slaves, was used as a sacred offering. Horrifying, absolutely. But to them it was a serious mystical technique. The gods did not appreciate being neglected, and if a bull didn't show enough devotion, then a living person was the next best thing. And we haven't yet mentioned the national flame, not metaphorical, but a literal fire kept burning in the temple of Vesta. It was guarded by virginal priestesses known as the Vestal Virgins. They weren't allowed to love to laugh loudly, and most importantly, they were never to let the flame go out. If one of them fell in love and lost her chastity, no trials, no shouting, only a deep pit where she would be buried alive in silence to avoid polluting the court. That fire was seen as the lifeblood of the state, and the woman a candle either lit or extinguished forever. And still there's more. A ritual custom during certain festivals called role reversal, where men played gods, women played goats, and the two chased each other around the temple grounds. Not a childhood game. This was a sacred rite. And the winner, blessed. The loser, possibly the father of a child no one dared question too closely. Such customs existed not because the Romans lacked reason. On the contrary, they had their own logic, the logic of a superstitious yet organized society, rational yet riddled with contradictions. They built laws, armies, and architecture, and quietly wove into all of it laws, born from ancient fears, fear of the gods of nature, of losing power, and most of all, of losing order in a vast empire. And so these customs, no matter how strange, were considered necessary. You see, sleeping in a world like ancient Rome probably wasn't easy. But luckily, you are lying peacefully in your own world, listening to a tale, not worrying about being led to the market tomorrow morning for arguing with your partner. So take a deep breath, whisper a quiet, "Thank you that I wasn't born in 100 BCE," and close your eyes as history reminds us, even the strangest customs were once the truths of their time. Roman society was like a layered cake, and you never wanted to be pushed to the bottom tier. At the top sat the emperor, worshipped as a living god, able to mint coins with his face and execute you simply for dreaming of his death. True story, that was Caligula. Right below him was the noble class, the senators and equestrians, who didn't necessarily ride horses better than anyone else, but were certainly adept at riding the waves of politics. These were the men in togas trimmed with purple, a symbol of high status and the legal right to cut in line. Next came ordinary Roman citizens, those who had the right to vote, marry, sue, and also the right to die for the empire. If you were a bona fide Roman citizen, you could hold your head high, at least until tax season arrived. Below them were the free non-citizens residents of recently conquered provinces, not yet upgraded to full citizenship. They worked, paid taxes, served in the army, and waited for the day they might be granted the title of citizen. Meaning they lived like Romans, died like Romans, but were not counted as Romans. And at the very bottom were the slaves, making up nearly a third of the population, at the empire's peak. They had no name, no rights, no legal family, and sometimes no hope. They were bought and sold like furniture, occasionally used as human oil lamps. Sorry, Nero again. But there were exceptions. Some highly educated slaves served as tutors, secretaries, even accountants for the elite. Some were granted their freedom and became freedmen starting over, but always bearing the mark of having once been owned. In that deeply stratified society, women were a special chapter. Roman women couldn't vote, hold office, or become priests except for the Vestal virgins. They were managed by a sequence of male guardians, father, husband, then son. Yet some women strong and wealthy stood behind great families, quietly influencing politics with their gentleness, though they had to do it very discreetly. Because a woman who is too clever unsettles the gods. And what about the city itself? Rome was an ancient megacity with an estimated population of over 1 million at its height. But forget the glamorous image you might be picturing. Apart from the wealthy who lived in villa-style mansions, most people crowded into insular multi-story apartment blocks with paper-thin walls, no private toilets, and a tendency to collapse during heavy rain or fires. And yes, fires in Rome were common, not because people were careless, but because of the perfect combination oil lamps plus wood plus fourth-floor apartments with no windows. Still, life went on. Each morning, Rome awoke to the cries of street vendors, the whispers of fortune tellers, and the pungent scent of fermented urine used for laundry. Sorry, the insomnia truth is often salty. As for entertainment, Romans loved it. If you were a citizen, you could enter the Colosseum and watch lions and men fight to the death for free. You could also cheer at the Circus Maximus during chariot races, with high-speed turns rivaling modern action films. And if sports weren't your thing, you could visit the public baths, not just for bathing, but to meet friends. Do business, play board games, get massages, grab snacks, and gossip. The Roman bathhouse was Facebook plus Starbucks plus bathroom all in one minus the Wi-Fi. So, what in the end was ancient Roman society, a world full of contradictions? An empire that worshipped logic but was steeped in superstition. A society that honored virtue but built its glory on the backs of slaves. A Rome magnificent, breathtaking. But if you sat down on the cold stone bench in the middle of the forum, you might hear a distant sigh from the past. Don't just admire what glitters. Look closely at what's buried. And as your bedside lamp dims, remember if you're falling asleep on a soft mattress, not hearing the screams of chariots outside your window, and not worried that a sneeze might offend Jupiter, you are living in a much luckier time. Wonderful. Now, let us continue our journey with a stop at Roman education, where children didn't just learn letters, but also how to stay silent, bow their heads, and never talk back to the teacher if they still wanted to walk properly by the end of the day. Education in Rome, as you might guess, wasn't a right. It was a conditional privilege, especially for children born into wealthy or noble families. These kids often began schooling very young, around the age of 6, and the path ahead was almost as long as the road to the Colosseum, but with slightly less bloodshed, only slightly. The first level of schooling was called ludus literarius, similar to elementary school. The teacher was a ludi magister, often an educated slave or a free man with spare time and a strangely high tolerance for chaos. There were no fixed classrooms, no plastic chairs with 4 legs. Lessons often took place in the corner of a temple courtyard, under a tree, or beside a column that hadn't yet collapsed. Lesson plans not needed. Just a wax tablet, a stylus made of bone or metal, and a small whip to assist memory. Children learned to read, write, and do arithmetic. No calculators, of course. Instead, they used small stones, called calculi, the ancient precursor to today's exam anxiety. And don't think you could get out of tests. Misspell a word, whip. Get a math problem wrong, whip. Look out the window while the teacher is talking, whip with momentum. If you were old enough and rich enough to continue, you graduated to the next level grammar school with a grammaticus, a teacher of literature and language. Here students began to wrestle with Homer, Virgil, and Ovid, poets fond of archaic words, endless sentences, and philosophical concepts that could make an 11-year-old cry out of pure confusion. And if you're imagining group projects or downtime, forget it. In Rome, studying literature was a rhythmic, poetic, and completely joyless struggle. Education also had clear gender lines. Boys could go on to study rhetorica advanced classes for future orators, often a stepping stone to becoming a lawyer, politician, or a would-be emperor, if ambitious and fearless enough. Here students practiced the art of saying impressive things about topics no one asked about, a skill that remains surprisingly relevant today. And the girls, oh, they studied too, but usually only at the first level. After that, their curriculum shifted to subjects like graceful walking embroidery, slave management, and how not to get sold at the market for making bad porridge. Girls from noble families might also learn music, poetry, a bit of philosophy, as long as it was clear they weren't allowed to be smarter than their future husband. Because, as you know, the gods didn't like overly clever women. There were also famous philosophers and scholars who served as private tutors to elite families. For example, Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, once tutored Emperor Nero. But please don't cite that as a success story. Nero burned down half of Rome because he was bored. It proves that no matter how much stoicism you teach, if someone is inherently unhinged, even the best curriculum won't save you. Outside the classroom, Roman children also received a social education by watching their parents scold slaves, negotiate with grape sellers, or teach them how to ignore taxes. Practical skills like how to pretend to revere the gods in front of elders, or how to cry just sadly enough at a funeral to avoid being labeled unfilial, were passed down as if part of a natural, though unofficial curriculum that was nonetheless essential. Interestingly, education in Rome had no school holidays as we know them today. Except for national sacrifice days, important full moons, or blood sport events, children studied nearly year-round. No one launched a no homework month. There was no Teacher's Day, and certainly no youth sports festival. Yet somehow that very system produced brilliant minds. Cicero, Julius Caesar, Marcus Aurelius, men who could write philosophy, lead armies, compose poetry, and then die in tragic fashion. A living testament that education can take you to great heights, and sometimes all the way to the execution platform. In ancient Rome, medicine was a relative concept. People believed health was closely tied to the gods, especially Asclepius, the god of medicine, and Hygeia, the goddess of hygiene. Yes, her name is the root of the word hygiene. But between belief and reality, there was often a battlefield full of blood and no anesthesia. Doctors came from various backgrounds. Some were formally trained in the Greek tradition, based on theories of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these were out of balance, you'd be bled, made to vomit, or fed bitter herbs until balance returned. Other doctors were trained slaves or self-proclaimed practitioners who learned by watching others perform surgery, no license, no medical board, and certainly no insurance. If you were lucky, a real medicus might treat you. If not, a street vendor might try to cure your kidney stones by placing cold stones on your forehead and praying to Jupiter. Hospitals, not quite as we know them. The Roman army had its own medical facilities, valetudinaria, considered the ancestors of modern hospitals. Their wounded soldiers received care at a standard higher than that of civilians. For the average person, treatment often occurred at home, at the market, or in temples. Yes, really, you could go to the temple of Asclepius, sleep there, and hope the god would appear in a dream with a prescription from the heavens. And if you needed surgery, oh, buckle up. Scalpels were made of bronze or iron, heated in fire to sterilize, or maybe just to cut faster. No anesthesia. Patients were tied down, given wine or opium, and prayed. Bladder stone removal. It happened. Amputations also real. But the outcome often involved an expedited journey to meet the goddess Hygeia sooner than expected. Strangely enough, despite its harshness, ancient Rome wasn't short on medical innovation. They developed various ointments and poultices made from honey vinegar herbs and animal dung. Not a joke, some topical remedies used fish or cow feces, believing the heat and moisture would draw out pus from wounds, though it often ended up drawing patients to the neighbor's house instead. As for obstetrics, it was a double horror. Women gave birth at home, usually assisted by midwives who held no licenses but had experience from helping their cousin's neighbor once. No ultrasounds, no C-sections. In difficult deliveries, some Roman doctors dealt with the situation by pushing the baby back in and hoping for a miracle. You now understand why many women didn't survive childbirth. Still, it's undeniable Rome was ahead of its time in certain aspects of public health. They built sewer systems, public toilets, and bathhouses, innovations that would make medieval Europeans jealous 1,000 years later. Water flowed through aqueducts, supplying baths, fountains, and even high-end latrines. Rome understood that cleanliness is health, at least technically. However, the idea of medical hygiene hadn't quite caught on in practice. A doctor might examine you right after handling an amputation. No gloves, no hand washing, no masks. If you survived, you were considered strong of fate. If not, clearly the gods had called your name. And when death approached, Romans didn't call for an ambulance. They called fortune tellers and family to perform farewell rites. Burn incense, anoint with oils, and wait for the final breath, sometimes with trumpets, sometimes just a quiet gesture, eyes closed, soul released. Medicine stopped there. No CPR, no defibrillation, no resuscitation. Only belief or despair, depending on how you interpret it. So yes, Roman medicine was a blend of budding science, deeply rooted superstition, and a touch of prescription-free recklessness. You might laugh or shudder. But remember that civilization laid the groundwork for much of modern medical knowledge, even if they once treated malaria with garlic and epilepsy with gladiator blood. Yes, you read that correctly. Now take a deep breath. Be grateful your doctor wears a mask and close your eyes. Not from lack of oxygen, but because you're safe, at least not washing wounds with vinegar and ashes. Sleep well, patient of the past. And remember, if you dream of a Roman doctor, run. Politics in ancient Rome was not for the faint of heart. It was a grand game of strategy that stretched over 1,000 years, with ever-changing rules and winners, usually being whoever stayed alive. Even during the Republic, before emperors took center stage, Rome had already invented a tripartite system of power: the Senate, the magistrates, and the assemblies. Sounds democratic, right? Well, except that most ordinary citizens had little real say. The Roman Senate wasn't a place for old men playing chess, but the true center of power, with hundreds of members, mostly nobles, who inherited their seats and were masters of long speeches, longer schemes, and the occasional lie. They didn't command, but issued senatus consulta advisory statements you couldn't afford to ignore if you wanted to survive both legally and physically. Meanwhile, executive officials like the consul praetor and quaestor carried out laws and managed the state. But don't think holding office was all about public service. It was also a status symbol, a license to use armed escorts, and a way to line your pockets. A successful praetor might be assigned as governor to a province, and if lucky would loot enough gold and jewels to retire with honor, unless he got sued for corruption. And the people, they could vote. But only in assemblies stratified by wealth, meaning the rich had votes that weighed more than the poor. And if you were poor, your ballot was basically a piece of scrap paper. When the Republic could no longer withstand ambition and civil war, Julius Caesar emerged like a wildfire, brilliant, dangerous, and unapologetic. He crossed the Rubicon, forbade retreat, and ushered in the era of one man rules, all obey. After Caesar was stabbed to death like a ripped cushion right in the Senate by colleagues who once called him "Dear Friend Rome," swiftly transitioned into an empire where politics became a survival art form. The emperors, from Augustus Tiberius to Nero and Caligula, ruled with absolute power. They were the law, the morals, the treasury, and the national television. If such a thing had existed, they could distribute gold to the masses, host hundreds of bloody games, and then the next day, order the execution of their own brother for dreaming of a wobbly throne. If you were a senator under the empire, don't think you were safe. Every speech could be a trap. Every overly enthusiastic compliment to the emperor might be seen as sarcasm. Failing to clap in sync when the emperor entered might be considered treason. Politicians of that era often allied themselves with the military, not out of patriotism, but out of a love for coup opportunities. Generals like Pompey Mark Antony and later Vespasian all learned a simple truth: want to rule Rome. Bring your army to the city first, talk ethics later. Still, there were politicians who fought with their minds instead of daggers. Cicero, for example, was a master orator capable of making you agree, even if you had no idea what you were agreeing to. He warned against tyranny and the erosion of democracy, and then, in a bitter twist of fate, was beheaded. His hands nailed to a post and his tongue cut out, as if the victors were telling the world never to speak too much again. Deeper still was the world of backroom deals, where nobles, merchants, philosophers, and even priests met in public bathhouses, scrubbing each other's backs while deciding the fate of a province. You didn't need a seat in the Senate, just money influence, and someone who could deliver news faster than a racing chariot. And, as you can see, Roman politics, though ancient, was frighteningly modern in one very unsettling way. It was a web of power, money, ambition schemes, and a razor-thin line between national hero and dangerous traitor, sometimes separated only by a single glance from the emperor. Now let me lead you away from the brightly lit villas, past the glittering marble squares, and straight into the dark alleys where the moans of the forgotten were never recorded in history books. Here you'll meet the ordinary Roman citizens, those who lived, breathed, worked, starved, and died without a single monument bearing their names. You know, when people mention ancient Rome, they often picture grand arenas, wine-soaked feasts, and togas whiter than laundry commercials. But the vast majority of Rome's population, about 90%, were never invited to those parties. They lived at the bottom, where the dream of bread and wine was sometimes just a bowl of thin porridge with a pinch of salt. The poor laborers, farmers, hired hands, often lived in buildings called insulae, multi-story tenement blocks made of brick and wood, usually slanted, creaky, and swaying whenever strong winds blew. No elevators, of course. If you lived on the 4th or 5th floor, you had to carry buckets of water up yourself. That's also why the upper floors were cheaper and more dangerous, prone to fire collapse and several hundred steps from the nearest public latrine. They had no private toilets. Need to go. You had to head to a public latrina where you'd relieve yourself while chatting with the person next to you. And if it was a freezing night and you didn't want to go outside, you'd use a chamber pot and dump it out the window the next morning. So if you were walking the streets of Rome at sunrise, you had better wear a hat and move fast, lest you catch the morning in the most literal way. Food. Don't expect braised beef in grape sauce or honey-glazed fish like the nobles. The poor ate dry bread, barley porridge, boiled wild greens, and sometimes bread made from flour mixed with wood ash. A kind of fake bread that was ultra-cheap, ultra-hard, and could convince your teeth to retire after one bite. Children. They had no painted wooden toys or Montessori preschools. They were educated with shouting beatings, and if lucky, a few letters from a literate father. Often a 7-year-old was already hauling water at the market, carrying goods, watching livestock, or hawking goods alongside their mother. Poor women didn't have it any easier. They woke early, cooked porridge, washed clothes by the Tiber River, where clean water and cow dung were equally common. Then went to the market to sell vegetables, or worked for the wealthy, scrubbing floors, heating water, watching children, hauling baskets. At night they mended clothes, rubbed oil into cracked hands, and sighed at the coins, still not enough to buy lamp oil. And illness was a silent sentence. The poor couldn't afford physicians, much less fragrant ointments or protective charms. They relied on leaves, ash, salt water, or prayer, then waited to see if they made it through the night. If someone died, there was no grand funeral. Just a coarse cloth, a roadside grave, and a whispered plea, "May the gods show mercy." Each day the poor went to markets or construction sites in search of work. No contracts, no insurance. If it rained, no work, no pay, no dinner. If you built well, you lived. If you slipped from the scaffolding, you died, and someone would replace you before sunset. And yet amidst the shadows of this life, laughter still echoed from children, chasing each other through the dust, from the toothless old man, telling made-up tales from the aimless singing of the bread vendor. Perhaps this is humanity's most beautiful instinct, to sing even on an empty stomach. The poor of Rome didn't write books. They didn't build temples. They didn't carve their names into marble. But they were the living foundation of the entire empire. They built roads, raised walls, hauled water-swept streets, and kept Rome standing until Rome drained them dry, then quietly forgot. Now climb into your imaginary chariot, hold on to your hat, and brace yourself for a journey full of potholes, shouting, and animal dung. We're about to talk about transportation in ancient Rome, an experience that will make your modern rush hour complaints look like a luxury. First, let's give credit where it's due. The Romans were brilliant road builders. They constructed tens of thousands of kilometers of stone roads that connected every corner of the empire, from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to what is now Syria. These roads, called viae, were paved with stone slabs, had drainage ditches, mile markers, and sometimes even rest stops. Yes, Roman era. Rest stops where you could change horses and nibble on some dry bread. An architectural marvel. A transportation network of epic scale. But that's on paper. In practice, Roman traffic was a test of both physical stamina and mental endurance, especially within the city. Rome at rush hour, which, let's be honest, was nearly all day, didn't just experience congestion. It was a groaning nightmare of wooden wheels, horse hooves, foul language, and smells beyond the scope of polite vocabulary. Streets were narrow, unmarked, without signals, and always partially blocked by a fruit vendor, 2 goats, and a pile of hay. The Roman authorities, not blind to the aroma of horse dung or the daily shouting matches of cart drivers, eventually banned chariots and wagons from the city during daylight hours. Unfortunately, that only turned the nighttime into a supercharged rush hour. Imagine trying to sleep on the second floor while a caravan of carts rumbles past your window from midnight till dawn, complete with wheel screeches, angry shouts, and the occasional crash of a barrel of salted fish. And if you were a pedestrian, congratulations, you were a moving target for wheels, hooves falling excrement urine dumped from upper stories, and aristocratic ladies walking their dogs off leash. Streets lacked consistent sidewalks. If you saw a raised stone edge, it might be a curb, or it might be a broken sewer cover. In the countryside, dirt roads. When it rained, mud. When it was sunny, dust clouds. Horses refused to move carts, refused to roll, and you, even if a state official, had to hike up your robe, grab your sandals, and wade through. As for vehicles, the wealthy could travel by litter, a curtained sedan chair carried by men, fairly luxurious. But remember, Rome was built on hills. If one of your bearers slipped, you'd enjoy a gravity-assisted slide straight into the fish market with complimentary scrapes and 3 live fish stuck to your tunic. And those with limited mobility, the sick, the elderly, were left to divine intervention. No ambulances, no wheelchairs. If you couldn't walk, you either stayed put or hoped 2 random men would carry you on a bamboo stretcher, ideally ones who hadn't been drinking. And water transport. Oh yes, the Tiber River was a major artery. But the water was filthy, boats were slow, and boatmen liked to sing while drunk. Cargo ships could be robbed mid-river or capsize from overloading. There were no maritime safety regulations. Just a whoever survives gets to tell the tale policy. It wasn't uncommon for an important figure to die before reaching a meeting point, not from assassination, but from traffic congestion, combined with a burst blood vessel from sheer frustration. In summary, Rome invented modern roads, but not the art of smooth travel. It was an era where every journey might end with you kissing the feet of Jupiter, or at the very least chipping a tooth in the middle of the marketplace. And now, as you lie in bed listening to the gentle hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of cars in the street, be grateful you don't have to wake up at 3 a.m. to get your cart out of Rome before the city's curfew kicks in. Wonderful. You're still awake. Then let's take a turn into one of the most bustling, chaotic, yet colorful and flavorful places in ancient Rome, the marketplace where every social class collided not to debate philosophy, but to haggle, yell, and search for unbruised lettuce. The Roman market was nothing like the shiny supermarkets with rolling carts you're used to. It was more like a massive countryside fair set in the heart of the city, full of dust noise and very expressive smells. The main commercial hub was the Forum Romanum, not just a marketplace, but also a place for spreading news, filing lawsuits, and occasionally holding trials while people weighed fish. Here you could find everything for sale, from dry bread, fresh grapes, strong wine, and fatty meat to oil lamps, clay pots, rope, and even wax deities. That's right. Some vendors specialized in selling amulets or tiny statues of Jupiter or Venus to hang in your home for luck and flu prevention. A typical morning at the market could jolt you awake faster than a cup of Roman coffee. An old woman screaming about being sold a swapped rotten fish. A young man advertising goods through self-composed poetry. A little child selling basil but sneakily eating half of it. A donkey suddenly pooping in the middle of the road, blocking foot traffic entirely. And of course, pickpockets were everywhere. If you bent down to inspect an eggplant, your goatskin wallet might already be liberated. Men often hid money in their belts. Women tucked it into their inner garments unless they wanted to buy vegetables and lose their coin purse in the same breath. Vendors in the market could be slaves selling on behalf of their masters, widows supporting their children, or foreign merchants. Greeks, Jews, Egyptians bringing exotic goods like spices, perfumes, and purple-dyed cloth. Purple being reserved for nobility, of course, but who can stop someone from dreaming? Each market had its own distinct section. This corner sold vegetables, the scent of damp earth lingering in the air. That one offered meat blood dripping into stone gutters, flies circling in ritual spirals. Farther off was the fish stall where housewives competed to choose the least rotten catch. The antique and scrap metal section, ah yes, where old men in threadbare furs gossiped about politics while sharpening blunt knives. And how about trying to haggle here vendor 1 denarius for this basket of grapes? They're too bruised, half a denarius. Vendor, what do your grapes grow in the heavens? You know, but at least they don't come with ants. Vendor ants mean sweetness. It's food, not a legion. Result, you buy it anyway and realize at home you still got swindled. As the sun climbs, the market turns into a furnace. Men take off their tunics. Women fan themselves, and the mingled smells of wine, sweat, spices, and street songs become a symphony without a name. But it is the thumping heartbeat of Roman life. The market was also a hub of rumor. People heard about the emperor's anger, their neighbor's affair, or the rising price of wine, all passed from the fishmonger's lips to the water carrier's ears in the span of a morning. And though chaotic, messy, full of traps and strange odors, the market connected Rome. It didn't need arches or temples, just a few cloth awnings, an old table, and a voice that could shout loud enough. So yes, the Roman market wasn't just a place of material exchange. It was where millions of fates met in everyday disarray. If you want to understand a civilization, don't look at its palaces, go to its market. And now, as you settle into a bed scented with fabric softener, imagine yourself standing in the Forum Romanum, holding a wicker basket, dressed in a tunic, squeezing past a stubborn mule just to buy some decently priced greens. May you dream of haggling successfully. And if you dream of being pickpocketed, don't worry, that's an authentic Roman experience. Sleep well, ancient merchant. You've come a long way with me, from Rome's bizarre punishments to its dusty corners, where lives were bought, sold, and bartered. You've crossed cobblestone roads full of horse droppings, witnessed the perilous politics, where even a sideways glance could be treason, and seen the lives of the nameless, the powerless, who were truly the silent soul of the empire. And now, as night grows late, and the modern world hushes outside, let us gently step away from the stone roads, the blood-stained arenas, and the bustling markets. If you ask me what makes ancient Rome truly remarkable, I wouldn't say the emperors or the grand military victories. I'd say it's how they lived, rough, contradictory, bizarre, and deeply, deeply human. They built temples to appease the gods and then held public executions beneath them. They worshipped philosophy and reason, but feared the omen of a crow's cry. They had great orators, but handed the power of life and death to whoever won the sword fight. Rome wasn't perfect, which is why it feels familiar. It's a magnified version of us, ambitious, loving, foolish, and afraid of the dark in ways we rarely dare admit. Maybe this ending is like the end of a day in ancient Rome, when fires flickered in small hearths, when mothers held their children and whispered tales of gods in the clouds, when fathers returned from building sites exhausted, staring at the stars, unsure if work would come tomorrow. And maybe in those quiet moments, Rome was at its most beautiful, not in victory, but in persistence, in people who continued to live, love, and hope, even with nothing more than a crust of bread in hand. So tonight, if you feel tired, if you're lying there anxious about tomorrow, remember this. Millions once lived just like you. People who owned little more than a threadbare cloak, but still looked up at the sky and whispered to the gods, "Please let tomorrow be a little better than today." They weren't heroes. They weren't emperors. They were just people, but they made history. And so do you. You don't need to conquer the world. Just live one full day, breathe one long breath, and know that being here still standing is its own kind of bravery. So then, dear friend, thank you for walking through this long night with me. Thank you for listening, not just with your ears, but with your soul. I hope that in the strange, sometimes smelly tales of ancient Rome, you found something, a laugh, a pause for thought, or just a long yawn before sleep. Now close your eyes. This room, though modern, has become part of the strange time-traveling journey we've just taken. Let your mind drift to the stone-paved roads where the sound of hooves fades and the Roman night closes beneath the moonlight. Sleep well, citizen of the world that never sleeps. Tonight you are no longer alone with the ticking clock. You have history beside you, the spirits of those who once lived like you, and a dream waiting on the other side of the silence. See you again in the dreams of ages past.